Third-party enforcement of a peace plan only works when you can swing the war incentives, and the parties believe that you will follow through on your threats to do so if they refuse. And both are big problems here. At some point this month, the talk about peace talks will end, and the Trump administration will begin deciding exactly how it wants to handle the situation in Ukraine. Now, Trump being the wild card that he is, this could all turn into a whole lot of nothing. But the consensus expectation is that he will demand that the parties reach a ceasefire, and he is prepared to use the force of the US military to make that happen. But the devil is in the details, and there are a lot of details in play here. That is why today we are going to take a hard look at the Trump peace plan. Review the half problem that often gets discussed as it relates to what happens if he just cuts Ukrainian aid, which is a solved problem, fortunately, and then cover the 5 more serious unsolved problems that could arise with it. Whether Trump can reliably and credibly threaten to arm Ukraine, where the weapons would come from even if he wanted to, whether Russia will believe any of this before it happens, how Europe might pick up the slack if the United States drops off, and whether the United States will provide aid to Ukraine in the long run. Let's get the half problem out of the way quickly because it is a recurring theme on this channel. We often hear about how aid to Ukraine will be cut, and that this will somehow magically result in peace. However, the mechanism that connects that premise to its conclusion is vague. Remember, the first-order effect of cutting aid is to shift the expected outcome of the war westward. That makes Russia inclined to raise its bottom line, and Ukraine to lower its bottom line. But if both of these revisions are happening to equal degrees, then we end up no closer to the end of the war. That said, a simple aid cut is not the peace proposal with the most traction currently in Washington. We correspondingly turn to Keith Kellogg, who is Trump's pick for Special Envoy to Ukraine, and co-author of a proposal that we have featured on this channel for months now. The basic idea is conditional armament. Hold fixed some line that will freeze the conflict. To be clear, there are a host of problems with where to draw said line. Most prominent is that there are distributional consequences here, because territorial possession is zero-sum. Then there is the tricky question about what exactly to do with Kursk. The only thing I have real confidence to say on this point is that using the Dnipro River as a defensive barrier down south is almost certain. And look, these are important points that someone will need to address. It is just not me, and not today. In fact, there will probably be some interesting conversations in the White House to that effect, even if Trump seems famously ambivalent about the specific line to draw. In contrast, Kellogg at the beginning of the year was ardently against Russia keeping any gains, though that was before Russia was making consistent progress in the second half. Then again, he has also been critical of recent Russian tactics in the war. It is all a bit of a mess. Regardless, focusing on a specific line is less important than understanding structural problems with a peace agreement, so we will save most of the discussion on specific lines for another video. Anyway, fix some division somewhere. If Kyiv does not agree to it, then the United States cuts aid to Ukraine. If Moscow does not agree to it, then the United States massively ramps up aid to Ukraine. The consequences of those aid flows are reflected in the shifting lines that you just witnessed. In effect, Washington plays the role of kingmaker. It can force the parties to reach a deal by making the expected war outcome really bad for whomever is the holdout. Now, I realize that the title of this video is 5.5 Problems with Trump's Peace Plan. However, structurally speaking, we have a logically valid strategy. It is a good foundation. Whether you like the idea or not depends on your political preferences, of course. Remember, my job here is to tell you whether a bridge can be built, not whether it is a good political idea to build it. Put differently, the point is that if my class assignment was, write a peace proposal that is well grounded in the theory of war, this would get an A. and that is more than I can say for a bunch of the other ideas that I have seen floated out there. So, if you are watching this, General Kellogg, well done. But let's chat for a moment about where this could still run into some problems. After all, there is a big difference between saying that a bridge can be built and actually building it. We should start with the credibility of Trump's threat to flood Ukraine with military aid. Remember, the deal only works because each party believes that there will be a bad war outcome for itself if it refuses. But for this line to actually be this line, then Trump must arm Ukraine should Russia not play ball. Otherwise, we are moving it back to here. Well, Trump has spent the better part of 2 years railing against all of the money that the United States is wasting on the defense of Ukraine. He has also voiced concern regarding potential runaway escalation with Russia, the risk of which would undoubtedly increase if the United States expands its role in the war. Yet, now suddenly that aid is going to massively spike? I guess maybe. As I said earlier, Trump is a wild card, and he has a tendency to change policies on a dime. Now, there is an upshot here compared to what would happen if you tried to implement this same deal under the Biden administration instead. The aid increase necessary for this operation would require congressional approval, and that has not been easy over the last 3 years, because Republicans have dragged their feet on this throughout Biden's term. But if Trump were to suddenly come out in favor of greater aid, conceivably a bunch of those Republicans would get on board too. Although fiscally conservative isolationists may still hold out, the Trump loyalists and Democrats combined together would have enough votes to push the legislation through Congress. Okay, let's suppose that Trump will want to flood Ukraine with weapons. Another credibility problem arises. The United States will have a hard time physically doing that. So far, American aid has come in the form of looking through its warehouses, seeing what is there, and clearing the space so that newer, shinier weapons can be built. But there is only so much overstock available. At some point, you need to start drawing down the good stuff. Now, the argument is there to do this. Some portion of the American supply is to ward off Russian hostilities. If Ukraine is destroying Russia's military capacity, then the need for extensive reserves diminishes, though it does not completely disappear. I still have 90 minutes on that in case anyone forgets about China. Nevertheless, a deeper problem remains. At some point, the United States would have to start replenishing its supplies, both for its own shelves and to send to Ukraine. And America's latent domestic capacity to do so is not what it once was during the Cold War. Heck, in an absolute emergency, Washington would probably have to look south of the border for help. The problem is that Trump would have to pair a large aid increase with a substantial investment in American arms production, which even then would take years to fully realize. But let's jump into the future where that capacity now exists. Great, we have solved all of the problems with Trump following through on the proposal's threats. But will Russia believe any of it? Remember, the plan's central logic to end the war is for the United States to play kingmaker. What makes this attractive from the perspective of the American taxpayers is that if things go according to plan, you do not actually pay to successfully coerce Russia into it. Rather, the threat of aid to Ukraine is enough to get Russia in line. The question is whether Russia buys any of those threats as being credible. If the Kremlin is skeptical, then the deal will not get done, aid to Ukraine will indeed increase, and then we will see if Russia rethinks its position afterward. Surely, Washington will try to communicate its intent beforehand. I imagine this will take the form of, look, Trump wants this done one way or another. Putin can decide whether we do this the easy way or the hard way. But welcome back to the old cliche, don't listen to what leaders say, watch what they do. Indeed, a skeptical Russia might hear all of those threats and reason that Trump is as serious about them as the Kremlin has been about all of those red lines issued over the course of the war. And that seems to be where things are headed right now, with the Kremlin preemptively vetoing any plans that Trump intends to put into place. Now, there is one thing that Trump can do to put more heft behind the threat in the lead-up to any peace negotiations. Nope, it is not giving out pizza. It is to simply start lifting restrictions in advance. Talk is cheap, but weapons are not. Sending them across the Atlantic would add some credibility to the ramifications that Russia would face. And it appears that Trump is going down this road, pressing European allies to spend an even larger share of GDP on defense, while simultaneously planning to continue aid to Ukraine. The execution of this strategy could throw an interesting wrench into the overall plan, though. It is possible that the additional support may allow Ukraine to start making some gains along the front, which would then begin an interesting discussion about whether to perhaps punt on negotiations, at least until Russia is willing to relinquish more of the occupied territories. Let's switch gears for a minute. We have spent all of this time discussing whether the United States would ramp up aid to Ukraine if Russia refuses. But what about the aftermath of cutting aid to Ukraine? Remember, what makes Ukraine compliant here is that refusal to negotiate leads to a drop-off in its expected outcome, because the United States will pull its aid. But then the question turns to Europe. Will other countries simply step in to fill the void that the United States leaves behind? And will that be enough when combined with Ukraine's domestically manufactured weapon systems? Now, Europe is not going to magically make Ukraine more powerful than before, but there is a big difference in American abandonment leading to an outcome like this versus a more modest drop-off to here. And to add to the intrigue, Europe is in an even worse position than the United States to pick up production slack. Consequently, if Europe wanted to close the gap, it would have to solicit Washington's help. Then again, at least if Europe comes knocking on the US door to buy weapons, Trump is hardly going to say no. One problem here is that buying all of those weapons will cost a lot of money, and it is not like European governments are clamoring to see a massive expansion of their defense budgets. Well, maybe the border countries are. They are much more worried about the situation if Ukraine falls, and they tend to find themselves visiting Ukraine more frequently than the others. But those others are a bit financially tighter. Do not be surprised if there is further discussion to tap into the frozen Russian assets. In any case, if Europe would respond in this way, then the Trump administration would first need to get its cross-Atlantic partners on board before progressing further. And that is a problem because they are also skeptical. The easiest solution there is to go stricter with what the terms of the ceasefire would look like. Trump might not care much about which division goes into the ceasefire, but Europe is right there, and thus internalizes the difference between the two. Of course, the further east you go, the harder it will be to convince Russia to go with it. Nothing about this comes easy. Lastly, we must address the long-run enforcement of a deal. I will say it again. Credible peace agreements need to be commensurate with how a war would play out otherwise. But where the balance of power lies today might not be where it lies a year from now. If the balance of power starts creeping away too far from the ceasefire terms, then either the lines will have to be redrawn, or the war will restart, and neither of those are attractive options. This matters because Russia is unlikely to simply stop its military investments once the war ends, and the types of terms being floated right now are not in line with where things are trending in the war. Indeed, we talked about that before in the context of Ukraine either joining NATO or building nuclear weapons. Ukraine may worry that with peace will come complacency in the West. If aid will fall off post-settlement and cause a bigger problem later, Ukraine would want to continue the fight and continue accepting arms from whichever willing donors remain. On a related note, Russia has similar concerns about how a shift in military capacity along a shorter time horizon. What you are viewing here are clips from Putin's annual end-of-the-year roundtable. Part of the 4.5-hour marathon was about how Ukraine does not have good front-line entrenchments in Donetsk, and that any pause in the war would give Kyiv time to fix that problem. Just another wrinkle to add to the mix. Now, unlike lack of maintenance at a time when sanctions are placing extra burdens on one's naval assets. None of these are guaranteed to sink a potential peace agreement. But they are the types of things that the Trump administration will need to consider as negotiations ramp up. To finish things off for today, it is worth putting all of this in the context of what Trump has done in the first few days since he entered office, which may not be the easiest thing to do given that the media's attention has focused on the bevy of executive orders that Trump signed immediately after reciting the oath of office. Seriously, look at how many of them that there are here. Well, Trump saved his most critical comments about Russia until after he became president, declaring that Putin is not doing well during his inauguration speech. Also, remember earlier in the video how I said that Trump was essentially pitching a peace deal as either doing things the easy way or the hard way? I wrote that back in the end of December. Then Trump went on social media and literally said exactly that in a post from January 22nd. And he is not wrong. The Russian ruble is having a very hard time as of late. Rewinding to the previous slide, it makes you wonder what else could happen if Trump followed through on threats to increase sanctions against Moscow. Aside from that, I have been showing the exchange of territory up through November in this video. But if we add December to the mix, Russia's pace is slowing, though a caution that some of that may be due to inclement weather rather than a change in Russia's capacity. However, all of what you see here amounts to a lot of words, and we should not listen to those so much as watch what Trump is doing. In that regard, 3 things are notable. First, though mostly unrelated to the war, Trump's flurry of executive orders included efforts to increase U.S. production of oil and gas. That will deflate prices on the international market, indirectly contracting Russia's war chest. Second, Trump has shifted Keith Kellogg's timeline for a deal from 24 hours to 100 days. Now, 24 hours was never realistic, but 100 days is more cushion than was necessary. And the lack of rush means that Trump could exert further coercive pressure on Russia if he so chooses. Indeed, one of the executive orders that Trump signed on day one was to cut all foreign aid. Notably, though, military aid to Ukraine has been exempt from this list, so far anyway, which, as we discussed earlier, is a key preliminary signal about the credibility of Trump's threat to massively ramp up aid should Russia refuse the deal. And that may be key to getting things done, though whether Trump's optimistic comments mean that he will push for a dividing line more favorable to Ukraine remains to be seen. Meanwhile, a different deal that you cannot refuse are the great prices on these fantastic books about the war. Check the video description for more information about them. Also, jump over to my Lines on Maps Extra secondary channel for further Q&A about Trump's new term in office. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.